It's a fun activity. It's interesting. Even I just got it to school because the one time that I went to, it just gave me a whole bunch of that. Oh. Then I bought a couple of that. Worth 100. This is worth another 150. So I'm like, what are you doing? But even those are also starting to gain traction as in demand. It's just coming to be more expensive getting some of those businesses. That's not. Oh, yeah, that's good. Did you come up with anybody, or are you? No, just by myself. Oh, just by yourself. Yeah. straight red. Very polished, polished red. There it is.
Hi, John Warren.
Well, I'm going to take the opportunity to take the mask off. I'm so fed up with this thing. It's amazing. So, okay.
Well, to be selfish, we'll hear you better.
I'm going to wait a couple of seconds just to let everybody else that may be coming back.
So, John, how are the exhibits? Have you looked at them?
Say that again. I couldn't hear you.
How are the exhibits? Have you had a chance to look at them?
No, not yet. I hope to do that tomorrow, actually.
Okay.
So,
So is Ravi still there or is he gone?
I'm here.
well, I guess that's most of what we're going to get today. So I think we might just will start, Carol. So, all right. So, yeah. So here we go. Sacred Cows of Bundi. First, I want to give you a little outline of the state itself, and then get into the actual presentation itself. This is actually based on a one-frame exhibit that I have here at SEAPEX. And when you make a one-frame exhibit, the idea is to try and convey the specific information in a small amount of space. 16 sheets making one frame. As many collectors know, a real display of Bundi can actually be as many as 8 or 9 frames. So the challenge for a one frame is to try and condense as much information as possible into a very small amount of time. And that's what I've attempted to do. Of course, if I press this. Okay. The Sacred Cows of Bundi essentially last from 1914 to 1942. The first issue, when it came out, was described in the philatelic text as a important Raja surrounded by fierce bulls. And immediately the Bundi Postmaster General wrote back and said, no, they're not bulls, they're cows. And, you know, I'm afraid that the British publication didn't really appreciate the influence of cows on life in India. But there is an actual quote from the Postmaster General who set him to rights. I'm going to show you the designs in a moment, but these were designed to last a long time. And we can identify 9 different Devanagari inscriptions, which are known as types, and we can identify 58 different printings, which we call settings. Now, fortunately, there was only 4 cliches to the sheet of stamps. And by reference to the accumulation of nicks, dents, scratches, will tell you which setting it actually comes from. You must remember that although the post office had high hopes, every time it needed stamps, it would take the cliches together, print what they needed, then disassemble and throw them back on the shelf. And in doing so, that's what made the nicks and dents that we use to identify the actual settings. They were very careful to match the color with the denomination to prevent illiterate citizens from getting the wrong stamp. And in those days, there were 16 rupees to a dollar, 16 annas to a rupee, and a rupee was roughly worth 30 cents. But remember, 30 cents in the US went a lot further in India in those days than it does in US in those days. Here's the denominations issue. And you say, well,
John,
yes.
not to cut you off, but do you want to start sharing your screen so we can see the slides? You got to click the green button, at the bottom.
I thought I was, so thank you.
No, we get to, we've all been admiring you. We've been
Alan, you cannot complain. You're not even here. You're supposed to be here.
Yeah, just click on share screen.
Yeah, just click on the share. Okay, now click on the blue share up above. Yeah, there you go. Okay, now,
Okay, welcome back.
yeah,
Stop. Yeah. I'll just go
there you
back
go.
to
Yes. Push,
Click.
click, use the mouse. There you go.
Okay.
perfect. Thank you, John. Thank you, Carol.
Oh, thanks for telling us. We didn't know. Okay, here are the actual low denominations, and you'll see that they are pretty well differentiated by color. So, and it runs from a quarter anna up until 10 annas. And I think that you'll probably be a little surprised when I tell you that the half anna, quarter anna, 1 anna, and 4 annas were heavily used, and the others much less so. And I'll have something to say about that in just a moment. You'll notice then that it was a single design, single color up until the 1 rupee. Then they got fancier and made 2 colors for the 2 rupee and 3 rupee. And then for 4 and 5, they were very fancy indeed. Now the question comes up as to why would you do it like that? And I think it was sort of an artistic sort of, shall we say, attempt at making these things look as attractive as possible. Must remember, 5 rupees in those days, and this is starting around about 1917, was a tremendous amount of money. So you can imagine that they were very, very careful on how they printed and distributed these. Now, I'd like to sort of spend just a little bit of time showing you the types of inscriptions. And the inscriptions are made with Devanagari type, but they're drawn from a general stock. And over the long lifetime of the issue of stamps, the typeface changed, not because they wanted to, but because the old type simply wore out and they basically used what was available. So if you look at the stamps themselves, the types, you'll see that the number of settings that we know that use that type are written underneath. Interestingly, there's a gap for type B between 1921 and 1927, and that's probably due to the fact that they had alternative typeface that they could use, and it was just a simple matter of making sure that the top line read Raj Bundi, and the bottom line gave the denomination of the actual stamp itself. There are 9 types, and they are traditionally labeled type A through type I. And fortunately, they were used in approximately temporal order, meaning that sort of the very early ones are identified as type A or B, and then finally the later ones become up to type I, which was the final issue in round about 1942. And you can actually see when you compare the typefaces themselves that there is a tremendous difference when you look carefully at the actual typefaces themselves. Now, I must laugh a little bit because type D, I would have loved to have had, shall we say, the half Anna stamp all the way through in nice black. But type D was never used for a half Anna stamp. And so unfortunately, my beautiful scheme breaks down because I have to use a Vista colored stamp rather than a nice black one. But you can, I think, see that the differences in the typefaces are actually quite pronounced, which is why when you try and use Scott catalog to try and identify and collect by Scott listings, you're in a hopeless muddle. So you have to actually, have to sort of look at this using a Gibbons catalog rather than a Scott catalog. I'd like to show you just how much wear and tear there is. Here is a complete sheet, the 4 cliches, right, from setting 3. This is obviously printed on a very small press. So you can see that the rouletting, which is being used as a separator of stamps, goes over to the edges. It's a bit sort of uneven in places. And we can identify the actual cliches as being in order B, C, A, and D. The letters A, B, C, D are quite arbitrary. They were worked out in the very beginning of the issuance of the stamps by the literature at the time. And so rather than change to a more logical, perhaps, sequence, we use the original nomenclature that the literature in the early 20s actually came for. Let me show you a later one. Here's the setting 56, which is almost at the end of the life of the sacred cows. And you can see that the order has changed. They've now introduced perforation, and there are lots and lots of repair. Look at the first 2 cliches. They're known as A and B, but look at the amount of restructuring that has had to be done on the frame at the very bottom where the denomination is. And you can see that the things were wearing out and they had to do something about it. And sure enough, by 1942, they actually contracted with printers in England to make a completely new design. But let's see. Now I'd like to sort of go through the actual inscriptions themselves, and how I'd like to do it is to show you first of all a complete sheet, and then follow that by an example used on cover. Type A, you would think is the first one actually recorded. Well, it isn't. In actual practice, type B came first, then A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We got in touch with Mr. Gibbons, pointed out his error of all these long years, and got no answer. So what we've done is we've kept it the same with just a footnote in the research manuals that actually B came out before A. But let's start with inscription type A, and the key part of the inscription is the little arc on the second word in the top tablet that has a nice smiley face underneath the dot above the B of Bundi. So that is a big characteristic of type A. And here's an example on cover. I should say that covers from Bundi are actually reasonably common to get. And I say reasonably because some settings are much, much harder to find than others. Now let me stop right here and tell you something. I want to go back to just very, very briefly. See all these pretty stamps? They look nice. I mean, nice, and they're colorful and they're wonderful. Except, what exactly did they need all these for? As I mentioned before, a quarter anna was for a postcard, half an anna for a letter, 1 anna for a very heavy letter, and 4 annas for registration. Rumor has it that maybe they used all these as fiscal stamps. We have yet to find any fiscally used. And we are of the opinion now that these colorful things were more for vanity of the Maharaja rather than they were for actual use. And the way you can prove that is to note that some of those denominations were never reprinted after 1917 and were available for over 25 years. And obviously it was philatelic demand. So this gives an example of a typical half anna letter use. The postmark actually just says Raj Bundi because the post office was headquartered in Bundi city and did have a few minor offices outside, but that's too much to go into for this one. And at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to tell you what's not there and why it's not there. This is type B, and you'll notice now that the inscription has changed. There's no longer that little smiley arc underneath the second letter of the first row, and you'll see that the orientation of the printing sheet when they came to print was of no interest to the printers. They just grabbed the paper from the local market and just fed it into the press. They were not worried about orientation, whether it was sideways or just as long as it got the image of the stamps, they were quite happy. Here's an example on paying the postcard rate. This is actually an imperial postcard because of going out of state. And this was actually sort of 1919. So it was a very early example of the use of the quarter anna stamp. So quarter anna was always pale blue and the 1 anna was always black. Here actually is the half anna for inscription type C. The big thing about inscription C is the second, is the first character of the second word in the front row. in the top row. Do you see there's a large loop at the bottom? A large sort of, you can see a large, sort of almost like, I want to say an inverted question mark, but it's a very characteristic, very, very large. And so one easy way to distinguish between type B and type C is just look at that large loop. If it's a small loop, it's B. If it's a large loop, it's C. And here's an example going on an envelope to Qatar. Qatar was just across the border from Bundi, but it needed a ½ Anna Bundi stamp plus a ½ Anna imperial payment. So you can actually say, and of course, entrepreneurial dealers actually say, a rare combination cover. Well, it's a combination because it has to be. So, because Bundi stamps were not accepted outside of Bundi itself. Now, interesting enough, you can get the two inscriptions mixed together. And this is an example where inscriptions type B and C are present on the same sheet. Look again at the size of the loop under the word B for Bundi. And you'll see that on type B, it's very tight, and on type C, it is actually quite large. Here's an example on cover. This is a registered cover. It's got a beautiful black smudge on there. And I'm almost positive that's the recipient acknowledging the receipt of the actual registered letter. But I confess, I can't read the inscription across the side. If anybody here can read a little bit of that. Can anybody read the inscription? Yeah. I can't.
I can read the pencil marking below the stamp.
Sarkar, it says some Sarkar.
Sarkar, yeah, it's official.
Oh, so it might count as official. So that was, I was thinking about this. On
That
that.
is Sarkar. NS Sarkar or something.
Oh, which means it's a official.
Government
Okay.
service.
So that's more of an official. Thank you. Here on type D, the typeface is very skinny, very, very pushed together, and is really quite sort of identifiable. Notice again, please, the little tiny loop under that. You can see that it is very, very skinny and it's very, very sort of pronounced. But if you look incredibly carefully at one or two of, maybe I think just one of the other stamps there, you will see that tiny loop inverted. I just think that when they actually, the printer actually put the type together, he inadvertently looped it the wrong direction. Is it collectible? Well, yes. Is it listed? Gibbons thinks it's important, but in reality, I don't think it's worth a tremendous amount of fuss. And here's an example of the 3 annas being used for a registration rate. The registration rate for the period of time that the sacred cows were issued is under some study at the moment, because it seems to go from 4 annas down to 2.5 annas, back to 3 annas, and then goes to 4 annas, and we can't really determine when it actually happened. So research is underway now to try and correlate the dates that we know that it must have been a 3 anna rupee rate compared to 3 anna registered rate to when it actually tried to change to 4 annas. So that's one of the ongoing things that we're trying to look at. Now, type E, turn around and say, how can you determine that? Well, it's all comes with the first A of Anna. Previously, this had a different. Yeah, this is 1 Anna. I'm sorry, but I was looking for the word Anna. I'm sorry, that's Anna. Yeah, sorry. And it's the way in which the first A was actually written, because you have a choice. You can write it like this or like this. But I believe it's pronounced the same, isn't it? I think it's pronounced the same. And here's 3 examples on a cover. You can see that it was actually sort of a bit on the blurred side. I think that at one stage they tried to clean the cliches, but didn't do a very good job at it. And consequently, for a while, some of the printings are fairly murky, and obviously presents a problem for us today, because there has been forgeries, and it's very easy to sort of characterize one of the poor printings as being a forgery, when in actuality, it was really quite good. This is type F. They've cleaned the plate up. It looks much more professional. The A of Anna in the bottom panel is very similar to what they had in type E, but there is only one type F, this one. Quite clearly, when the printer put this together, he was unaware of the fact that he had actually used a slightly different typing. When you look at the Gibbons listing and you look at the historical listing, it's always been called a type F, but in reality, it's just a sort of a variation of type E. But we have it in there because that actual use of type F was only used for one of the printing. So it's really an accident rather than a deliberate, we're going to change the typeface. There's an example on cover. It's not a very good printing. The previous one was much nicer. I mean, the one I use as an example. The one I use here as an example, everything's nice and clean, but I think that after a short amount of time, it got to be a much more scruffy example. And so it's actually known as setting 33. So it's one of those of the scarcest of the actual settings. Things improved a bit with inscription type G, because Bundi is now written in 4 characters rather than the 3 that they used before. So you see there's 4 characters in the word Bundi now rather than 3. I don't think it makes any difference to the pronunciation, but I will defer to the other guys if it does make a difference. But it's useful for us that collect Bundi, because you can immediately turn around and say, ah, this has got to be type G or type H as we get further down. As an example on cover, very, very simple. I asked a very famous Indian collector, Colonel Shenoy, some 20 years ago, whether it was necessary to actually tell the person looking at the cover what that actually designates. Now, I cannot read it. I'm not sure whether anybody else can. They probably can, but I tried writing to the Bundi Technical College asking for help in translating old Bundi documents and got no reply at all. And Colonel Shenoy said, well, the reason for that is the language has changed sufficiently that students in that area today can barely read what was actually written, 40, 50, 60 years ago.
No, it's asking to appear in the court.
Oh, is it really?
It's a summons.
Oh, it's a summons. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I did not know.
Dollar application.
So probably not very welcome, I should imagine. Type H, you'll see that now the inscriptions are much, much larger than they were before, and actually, in some cases, can actually merge together. There are only a few of these, but in terms of printing, but here's an example. You notice there's now 4 annas as a registration rate. So, was the registration rate 3 annas plus 1 anna? Was it 3 annas inclusive of postage? Was it 4 annas including postage? It's difficult to tell. That's the research I mentioned. Perforation, a great improvement on things. And you can see that sort of this greatly facilitates things for removing stamps. But of course, these are line perf. And so it was actually a lot more effort to actually print the stamps and then perforate them. But it made for shall we say, a more unified system. Here's an example. Here's an example being used on a letter. Now, the thing that I find interesting is this inscription here. I can't read that, unfortunately. But on similar letters, I've discovered that people who can translate it says that it actually is a note from the postmaster saying that this letter has been refused. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But, anybody here can ask?
So it says, on top it says Rajda Bundi, then it says Lene Se Kar. I think
Probably refused. So
John, it says Lene Se Inkar, meaning refuse to accept.
refused to accept. Excellent. Thank you. And this is the final one, inscription type I. The first row is still in the very, very large, but now they've just gone back to one of the earlier typefaces that was used. A nice homemade cover. Yeah, so now I want to sort of just finish off. I've gone back to inscription type E, right? Because actually, this is now the very, very last of the printing. Now, why they went back to type E, we can't tell. But the reason putting there is because on the right is the rarest stamp of Bundi. It's the inscriptions are inverted. This was recorded earlier in the literature when somebody wrote into one of the journals saying he's just discovered a block of 3 of these things. And we have been able to trace the 3. Where the 4th one went, nobody knows. And it may have been bought by a collector from the Bundi post office and not realized that what he had actually got was actually something quite rare. So, all right, that was my last slide. And now I'm going to ask you a question. What's missing? Well, bicolor, that's probably true. But what's missing is the fact that all over Bundi stamps are overprint saying official. And it's called Bundi service. And it exists in Devanagari, a small English type and a large English type. They're very controversial. There's no way that you can deal with this in a one-frame exhibit. You need a bigger exhibit. Yeah. And so, well, that concludes it. That's what I've got for you. Do we have any questions? It's been very, very helpful. Very, very helpful, guys. You're for telling me what I don't know.
Very
Have
much.
you written this up for India Journal? Or is there a book out for it? Or
Okay.
are you gonna write the book?
Okay, that's a very good point. Back around about 1985, Benns, B-E-N-N-S, from England, wrote the handbook on the sacred cows of Bundi. And then unfortunately died of a heart attack. And over the last few years, I've tried to amend that book, and I have essentially made a second edition where it explains things a lot better, puts a lot of what I've showed you today up front so you can actually see it a lot easier. And I hope to have that accepted for putting on the India Study Circle website in the next few months. So yes, thank you. I hope to have it. And of course, if anybody here would like an electronic copy, I would be only too